Ngalakin Khadijan Nyunga Boja.
All right, let's look at a vital aspect of mining nowadays, environmental considerations. We can't pretend we're not having an impact on the environment, and we need to plan, design for good rehabilitation and responsible environmental behaviour that's acceptable to all of society. Of course, with the environmental side of things, there's lots of rules and regulations. So governments get involved. In Western Australia, as an example, the various reports you might have to write. I won't go through what these acronyms mean, but these are various reports you have to present to the government. The specific report you present depends on the amount of impact you're having on the environment, whether you're just pushing back the road 20 metres and knocking down one tree, or whether you're creating a mine from scratch. You require native vegetation clearing permit to clear land, so if you want to extend your workshop area, you can't just do it, you have to ask permission of the government, and it won't be granted if the land contains a high level of biodiversity or is significant for indigenous fauna to Australia, Western Australia, or continued existence of rare flora, or is significant as a remnant of native vegetation, etc., etc. Similarly, in Western Australia, you have a licence to operate, which is renewed by the government every year. So you have to report to the government what you've mined, how much water you've used, how much waste you've dumped, and how much land you've rehabilitated. Now let's look, so the whole area of government approval, environmental side of things is an enormous area. I'm not going to get into that at all. Let's look at some of the aspects of the environment that you have to worry about when you're designing and operating a mine. One of the things is surface water. So anywhere in the world will occasionally get rainfall, and that will form creeks and rivers and so on. And obviously, you put a mine somewhere, there will be creeks and rivers going through it. So you don't want to have your infrastructure or your pit flooding. Here's a picture of this is that brand new dragline which I mentioned in strip mining that Ancient Resources bought in Queensland, and about a year after it was bought, it was flooded. So that the river up there, there was an embankment, but obviously the embankment was not big enough for that particular storm, and it flooded. And then Queensland, 3 years later, had another series of really significant floods, and this is a mine where you can see that water is actually breached and going into this Lord Open pit, whereas this is the strip mine. So the consequences, financially, enormously significant. Could mean, see the trucks there, could mean make or break. This would have taken, I don't know how many days or weeks to drain, and then you can't just switch it on again. You've got to take it apart, dry out all the parts, check all the electrics, etc., etc. So you lost production for, I don't know how long, maybe 6 months. So millions and millions of dollars. It was covered by insurance, but even so, it's not what you want. I mentioned they did have an embankment again along the river, but it wasn't big enough. And that's one of the issues with climate change, is that we always try and design for 1 in 100 year storm event, but we seem to be having a 1 in 100 year storm event every few years. So the climate is that we can't just rely on past information. Plus, we don't have past information very often. I did a job once where we had to predict rainfall in the Northern Territory, and we had no rainfall data from the mine location. We had a mission station 10 kilometres away, and they, I think, had 40 years of rainfall. So that's the best we could get. So pretty hairy trying to predict with any confidence what a 1 in 100 year event is from 40 years data, slightly away from where you want. So we need to try and predict these, and obviously you have diversions, drains, embankments to try and stop that happening. Another type of water is groundwater. So surface water is the water you see on the surface. Groundwater is water inside the rocks, if you like. So if you dig a hole anywhere in the world, you will get, once you get below the groundwater, you will get water seeping into the pit. Won't necessarily pour in like a waterfall, depends on the geology. And you have a whole type of geology called hydrogeology, which will help predict how much water will flow in, because obviously it's not just the rock types, it's to do with porosity, permeability, and fractures and all sorts of things. But again, we need to get from the hydrogeologist an estimate, rough estimate, how much water will come in, and then buy a pump, pumps significant enough to be able to cope with that. So you don't want to get your pit flooding and damage your equipment. So that's one reason why you never only have one pump, in case one pump breaks. It might take a couple of days to get replacement parts, so you don't want that to happen. So that's just a pumping strategy. You also can de-water the mine, which means you put boreholes, drill holes around the mine, put pumps down there, and you pump out the water, and you reduce the overall water table, so you cannot get this. And the water you pump out is usually used, it's either recycled to the groundwater or used in processing. Not sure if you can guess where that is. Nice green area, there's the ocean there. This is the Waihi mine in New Zealand, North Island. It's a bit like Kalgoorlie in that they discovered gold 100, 150 years ago. Mined gold, the town grew up around the gold mine, and now the town is complaining about the mine being there. The mine, similarly again to Kalgoorlie, started off underground and now it's gone open pit, and they're pushing the pit back. Apparently that there is the main road, main street. So if they push the pit back any more, they would really encroach on the main street. So from a public relations point of view, they don't want to do that. They have done it previously and brought houses around. So from the public relations point of view, they'll go underground in those woods there and carry on mining deeper. When they were mining this in an open pit, because you're so close to the town, you do have to worry about things like just the noise of the equipment, vibration from blasts. And the issue, of course, is the rules and regulations about noise and vibration, but people will complain about a lot less than the regulations. So you could say, oh, well, we're right, the regulations say we're loud, but from a realistic public relations point of view, you have to cater for people who will hear noise, that don't like noise at night particularly, so that they turn off on the equipment here, they turn off those beep, 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 beep beepers when the equipment reverses, because that could be really annoying if you're trying to get sleep in that house there, etc. Vibration, noise from blasts. No real answer to that, apart from making the blasts a lot smaller. And that's the best way of doing it. You could look at things like trolley assist, which would reduce the noise of the trucks driving up the ramp. So a number of things you can do, but you just have to work to a higher standard than if you're not near a town. Dust. You will get dust, particularly in dry parts of the world. I think I mentioned before, in WA you have water carts which drive around the mine just to spray water to reduce the dust, but obviously that's not perfect. Here you wonder whether the operator can really see what's going on. Sure, she or he is fine in an air-conditioned little cab, but I'm not sure they've got such a good view of what's happening. And here's, I think, some sort of waste dump, a bit of dust there. That's not particularly an issue, but if you get winds and it blows, and maybe blows onto town people nearby, they won't like that. So there's something you need to worry about there. We are clearing the land, we are removing topsoil, and when I mentioned in surface mining, in strip mining, one of the keys to the successful rehabilitation in strip mining is the fact that you pick up the topsoil and move it and use it the same day or very quickly before all the bugs and enzymes die. In an open pit environment, you don't really have that luxury. You can't usually store the topsoil until rehabilitation starts. You have to take an audit of the flora and fauna which is on the land before you mine, so you can prove afterwards you've got the same number of plants, kangaroos, etc. as there were before. Then what do you do with the overburden and waste rock? In an open pit, you traditionally mine the waste and you put it in a large pile called a waste rock dump, which nobody likes, so we changed the name to call it a rock storage facility, but it's still a bit of an eyesore. Some people even call it now a landfill. And one of the points is this is a permanent structure. It's going to be there after your mine's finished for thousands of years. So it's not a temporary thing. It's going to be there for a long, long time. So it has to be stable and acceptable in appearance and vegetation to the government. So some of the things you need to think about with a rock storage facility when you're designing, make it stable. You don't want failures. You've got to allow for erosion. So you might be in a totally dry part of the world. You will sometimes get rainfall, and that will create little gullies, as you can see there, which in turn will wash away any vegetation that has taken hold. And the thing about gullies, they never get smaller, they only ever get bigger. You can see this waste dump here has been designed with a bit of a flat bit there. Traditionally, mining engineers build waste dumps as upside down pits with berms and batters and things, but that doesn't look very natural. This doesn't look very natural the way it's got this horizontal boundary there. So the shape of it is also a consideration. You can't just have an upside down pit, which to a mining engineer looks great, but the general public doesn't. You need to model it to the shape of the topography you're in. So the appearance does matter. And whether you shed or store the rainwater. And I'll just draw what I mean by that. The establishment of the vegetation, which is impacted by whether you decide to shed or store. If you store, you tend to get more vegetation growing. If you shed, you tend to get the vegetation washed away, but that's something you need to think about. And of course, what vegetation? And the rules and regulations, you will have agreed with the government what are the closure criteria, so you need to satisfy those, which might be things like the number of plants, the pH, etc. The other thing you need to really worry about is the chemical stability, which is something called acid rock drainage. So acid rock drainage is sometimes called acid mine drainage. It's a chemical reaction of sulfides in the rock. Not all rocks have sulfides, but an awful lot do. And the pyrite in that, and then oxygen, which is obviously everywhere, and water, which is everywhere after rain. And it's a natural reaction that occurs, but because we've blasted the material, we've fluffed it up, introduced lots of air, so that oxygen and water can get into it, so it just accelerates the chemical reaction, which causes a very low pH liquid, which increases the metal solubility, so the acid and elevated metals cause environmental damage, which is a nice way of saying nothing grows. And I've done a job at a mine in Northern Territory called Rom Jungle, where we had to clean up the mine site. It'd been left in the 1960s, I think. They just closed the gates and walked away. And around the waste dump, nothing grew for about 500 metres. And this is part of the Northern Territory, which is very green and fertile. Nothing grew. The pH was, I think, 3.5 or something. So pretty nasty. What are the solutions? Well, the first thing is to now incorporate as part of your design, part of your mine design. So in the exploration phase, we'll be looking at what rock types are potentially acid forming. So in our waste, we'll have probably several different rock types. Which ones are potentially acid forming? Not all of them are. We might even do some lab tests to find out. If we got some acid forming material, we can mix it with lime. That obviously costs money to do that. We can contain it So what you ideally do is surround the PAF material with non-acid forming, NAF material, so that the oxygen and water can't get in. Or you can actually buy membranes, like large tarpaulins, to put under the thing so that the water can't get through. But all that takes effort, takes money, takes time, and you might not have enough non-acid forming to surround the PAF material, so you might have to mine that specifically, which again adds to the cost. It is now part of the mine design, how you're going to cope with that. So ideally you try and contain the PAF, reduce the water and minimise the oxygen. And as a consequence, stop the seepage down into the watercourses. As I said, you can buy a geomembrane, they're called, to sit underneath it, which is guaranteed to run that water through. The slopes of the waste dump, so pits, we've been talking angles at 45 degrees, because they're not permanent things, apart from the final pit. Vegetation won't grow very well at 45, and you've got rainfall roaring down there, washing away any seeds that do grow. So the rules of thumb, you're looking at somewhere like 15, 18, 20 degrees, depending a bit where you are in the world, which of course means the waste dumps are a lot flatter, so have a larger footprint than if you built them at 45 degrees. You also think about what it looks like. So here we've got one where somebody's built it as an upside down pit, so you can see the berm, another berm up there, and some sort of ramp going up there, so it doesn't look all that natural. This is a concave, so you have the actual shape. This is typical of northern Western Australia, this sort of natural shape, so you try and get your waste dump to look like that. So a bench berm design is a lot easier to lay out and construct because it's just an upside down pit, so we're used to it. It is an accepted practice under current government guidelines in Western Australia. One advantage, the berms will tend to pool the water, which in turn will lead to high erosion as the gullies go down, but conversely you get more vegetation growing where the pools of water are. General slope 20 degrees. And then the much more complicated one, the concave, it's more analogous to natural slopes, looks better, but the materials we're building it with are not what nature's built the natural slopes with. So we're trying to get a balance between the slope, the surface water runoff, and the velocities. It's much more complicated to build, and there's limited height you can build with these as well. Here's some pretty awful examples. It's just horrible. You can see the berms, you can see all sorts of gullies, very deep, nothing growing there. See where somebody's driven up and down a bulldozer or something. Absolutely horrible. This one's a little bit better. You've got some vegetation growing on the berms where the water pools, but you're still getting some gullies forming along there. This is what I call the donut waste dump. So traditionally waste dumps, you just put the waste in the pile, just the pile gets bigger and bigger. This you start from the outside and build it inside and add to it inside. The advantage of that is you've got the outside limit is fixed and will not change. So with a normal waste dump, it just gets bigger every day. This one, the outside, is fixed, won't change, which means you can start to rehabilitate it, which is what they're doing there. They're putting some topsoil on there. So you can start to do that. So the general public, if the general public driving along the road here, they'll be happy to see it being rehabilitated, and they won't see it growing every day because the growth is on the inside. Obvious catch with this is you've got to get your volume for this correct. If you don't, then you have a limited space. You can't then have to extend it and you've lost all your advantages. Other impacts you need to think about: all undesirable waste materials must be isolated, removed, or buried as appropriate. Contaminated soil, drilling fluids, tyres, cement, human waste, chemicals, oils, cannot really just pour it out into the local creek. So you have to contain everything in your mine area. Here's some images from, that's an artist's view of the Waihi mine and the plan to rehabilitate the tailings. This is the actual tailings, so this is actually does have cows and grass growing on it. And this is a bauxite mine down south of Perth. So the key thing is the landforms have to be stable permanently, 1,000 years. Water, acid rock drainage, a major issue. It does not affect the flora and fauna. To remove the camp, roads, airstrip, everything, leave it as good as, usually better than it was before. With strip mining, I mentioned the in Western Germany, they have mined, come across the town, picked it up, and carried on mining and rehabilitated. So you can see that that's the mine before, and they turned it into recreational lake area, put the town back roughly how it was before. And this video talks about that.
Reclaiming the land after these open pit mines are closed has become an important issue all over the world. Germany has historically been a world leader in reclamation efforts.
This is a densely populated countryside, and we are disturbing hundreds and hundreds of square miles of terrain, and it is only fair that the public demands that this gets put back to some good use.
The design of both the wheel bucket excavators and the walking dragline provides for refilling the pit as the digging progresses, a significant efficiency when it can be utilized.
The location we are standing on was filled last night, and it will be buried under 30 or 40 or 50 yards of material in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
But to actually restore the land as this has been to a thriving natural environment can take decades.
There are two major conditions that make our reclamation so successful. The first one is we have a type of soil that is found here in the Rhineland, which we use as a topsoil in the reclamation, which is a guarantee for high fertility. Secondly, we have lots of experience and skill during the past 5 and 6 decades, and so we have learned a lot, and we're still learning to ever improve reclamation.
In the United States these days, a mine operator can't even open a new mine without an approved reclamation plan to fill it back in when he's done. The arid landscape of Wyoming is not nearly as lush as the German Rhineland, but it can be coaxed back to its natural state. Then it may remain wild or serve other human needs, such as farmland or development.
So that the scale of operations meant the whole community was picked up. So 35,000 people have been resettled due to mining operations in Rhineland, which is quite an achievement in a democracy to manage to do that. A bit closer to home, this is bauxite mines near Perth. So to the uneducated eye, that looks quite good. Of course, the problem is the area when they mined through it had trees 100 years old. So you can't really prove it's as good as it was before for 100 years. So it's a long-term thing. Here's another picture of a 20-year period of, again, it looks pretty good to the uneducated reforestation, but it's more than just the trees, it's the plants, it's the pH, it's everything. Now, you generally pay a bond to the local government, state government in Australia, similar to if you rent an apartment, you pay a bond to the landlord or lady. So if you trash the place, they've got some money to clean up. Same basic principle. So each government had slightly different rates, which vary between $10,000 and $50,000 per hectare of land. Probably so that you paid that to the government at the start of the mine, and then if something went wrong and you were left without cleaning it up properly, they had some money. It's probably safe to say that's not nearly enough for really bad conditions, 50,000. So one of the things that the Western Australian government was they looked at a different scheme. The other thing you have to think about is defining the measures, what constitutes acceptable closure at the start of the mine, which is pretty challenging. So you don't want to be in a situation where you just at the end go to the government and say, oh, we think it's finished, and they'll say, oh no, the pH is too high, and you come back and say, well, we changed the pH, we think it's finished, and they'll say, oh, not enough kangaroos per square kilometre, and so on. You need to agree on those things as measurable things, the pH, kangaroos per square kilometre, trees, etc., before you start really. I mentioned WA has changed its system of bond. It doesn't have a bond. It's changed it has a pooled fund. So each company has an annual contribution as 1% of the site's total rehabilitation obligation. So you worked out the total rehabilitation obligation based on the area and the type of land. So if it's just bush, 2,000, office, 20,000, tailings, 100,000. You then work it out as millions of dollars and pay 1% of that each year. So it's a tax. The politicians who created it obviously didn't call it tax because they don't like to say we increase taxes, but it is a tax. The advantage to the government is they'll probably end up with more money. 1% every year for the life of the mine is probably more than the bond. The advantage to the companies is they're not having to pay a large sum up front before they've started earning, which is pretty arduous, and they're paying just an extra tax as they go along, so it's financially easier for them. So it's a very attractive scheme which seems to offer advantages to governments and companies, but of course we're talking long term, so it's only been around 7 years, so it'll be a long time till we can say yes, that's worked pretty well. The use of the mine depends where you are, location and the stakeholders, landowners, who's there. So this is an old uranium mine up in Queensland. They've just left the pit. It's pretty stable, no failures, no vegetation growing, but I don't think much vegetation grows in that area anyway. So the local government has said, yep, leave it like that. Looks beautiful, like a brochure for a Fiji holiday or something. Colour that water. That Waihi mine in New Zealand is different because it's got lots of people living nearby. So they're going to let it fill with water, which will take something amazing like 30 years, and then have it as a recreational lake with fishing and water skiing and so on. And that makes sense because they've got people to take advantage of that. So that's, you adapt to where you are and what the local government says is acceptable. Here's an interesting one. This is near Shanghai. So this is So this is an old quarry, and they've built a hotel on the side of the quarry, and you've got some rooms above the water, others below it. I don't know if there's much price difference, which is preferable, and that's not the actual water in the quarry, that's the aquarium next to the hotel. Yeah, and it opened, I think, about 12 months ago, so if you go to the Internet Continental website, you can book a room there. There are the prices, off you go. Depends where you are. There's no point doing this in the middle of Australia because no people want to go there. This is near Shanghai, so there's literally hundreds of millions of people within a couple of hours, so it might work. Mine closure requires negotiation with stakeholders, so it's not just something the mining engineer can say, oh, that's what we do. You've got to get approval from the people who have some say in that part of the world. So you've got to have all of their interests considered, whether it's farmers, native title holders, governments. And the difficulty for engineers is always dealing with non-engineers, people who don't think the way we do. You've got to make sure the closure is orderly, cost-effective and well planned. You don't just get to the end of the mine and say, oh, now what do we do? Got to have the accounts clearly showing it, so there's money set aside. And the community, the local government, is not left with a huge liability. So clear accountability, who does what, and adequate resources, money, to make sure it can happen. And as I mentioned, establish clear set of indicators to show successful completion. So you ultimately want to get to the point where the company is satisfied, all these indicators, and the local authority will say, yes, that's fine. That might take decades. The real challenge is, of course, what society considered acceptable environmentally 50 years ago, we wouldn't consider acceptable now. So what will be acceptable in another 50 years' time? That's what we're trying to plan for. What will be acceptable in 50 years' time? Very hard to say. So that's one of the real challenges. All right, that's it, I think.